Hello and welcome to the first ever Combat Anti-Semitism Movement Annual Summit. I'm your host, Natasha Kirchuk, and we're so pleased to have you with us as we celebrate the second anniversary of CAM's founding. We're live on Facebook, on Twitter, Zoom, and YouTube, and if you miss anything, don't worry, you're gonna get an email recap and a link to a full video of the event. Now, 2 years ago, with anti-Semitism surging across the world on the streets, in the media, on college campuses, and at global institutions, CAM was established to bring people of all faiths together to fight religious prejudice and make the world a better place. In the past 2 years, CAM's achieved a great deal, but the societal illness of anti-Semitism hasn't gone away, and there's still much work ahead. Well, core to CAM's mission is the need to unite leaders and activists across the political and religious spectrums to combat all forms of contemporary anti-Semitism on a nonpartisan basis. So today, we'll both celebrate our accomplishments and look ahead to what's next. You're going to hear from a distinguished lineup of international leaders, partners, and grassroots activists, and get an in-depth look at the activities of our global network of allies in our collective effort against bigotry. The opening speaker session will be followed by a series of fascinating panel discussions, a special award ceremony for an esteemed honoree, and a moving musical performance. So, without further ado, let's get started.
I spent most of my life in hiding.
I saw students getting harassed.
We had someone vandalize our sukkah.
A man approached them screaming that they shouldn't speak to me because I was a Jew.
Yes, today in France you can get killed only because you're a Jew.
Anti-Semitism, humanity's oldest hatred, reawakened and engulfed by today's difficulties, and accelerated by the speed of the internet. In campuses, in the streets and public spaces, at synagogues and cemeteries, towards Jewish businesses, towards the Jewish state, and in the halls of power. A unified and modern approach is required to beat back this rising tide of hate. The Combat Anti-Semitism Movement is a nonpartisan global grassroots movement. We empower individuals of all backgrounds to raise their voices against anti-Semitism. Our diverse coalition uses its collective power to enact change through a global, interconnected, far-reaching platform. We monitor and educate about anti-Semitic incidents and trends taking place around the world to millions on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and other emerging platforms. We educate and inform through our weekly Global Anti-Semitism newsletter report and via powerful media outreach in order to impact millions around the world. Through ongoing advocacy and global initiatives, we engage world leaders, governments, institutions, and activists, and encourage the universal adoption of the working definition of anti-Semitism by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA. We count on the help of hundreds of partner organizations, hundreds of thousands of individuals, in more than 60 countries across all religions and faiths. Our expansive coalition establishes major global partnerships to strategically implement new and creative solutions to safeguard Jewish lives against resurgent hatred. In the struggle against anti-Semitism, CAM is mobilizing a new generation to stand up for Jewish civil rights, and in so doing, safeguarding the rights of all people and turning hate into hope. Combat Anti-Semitism Movement, making the world a better place.
I'm now turning the stage over to CAM Executive Director Sasha Roitman-Dratwa for welcoming remarks. Sasha?
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you.
Dear friends, members of the CAM Coalition, partners, and special guests, thank you for being with us today, but not only today. Thank you for being with us every day, giving us the trust, support that we need as a movement to combat the world's oldest hatred. The challenges we faced are daunting, but we are here today to celebrate our achievements over the past 2 years, innovating new solutions to fight Jew hatred of all forms whenever and wherever it exists. We are proud to count over 300 partner organizations and institutions in our coalitions. But not only, also 300,000 individuals standing up every day against hatred. Furthermore, we are extremely proud that our coalition includes Jews, Muslims, Christians, and adherents of other faiths. They are all united in a common mission. We do what we do to build a better world for our children, family, members, and everyone. When CAM was founded, our vision was to bring together individuals, decision makers, and organizations of all backgrounds to work in collaboration, and we are proud today that this is something we have accomplished. What we do requires more than one person or group. It demands unity and cooperation among a diverse network. I hope this summit will give our members and partners the energy needed to continue our fight and inspire those who are not part of our coalition to learn what we do and to join. Please, if you are not a member, take the time, visit our website, and become a member of our important movement to create a better world.
All right, thanks for that, Sasha. That was amazing. Now, we're privileged to welcome a very special guest. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin is joining us for an opening message all the way from Jerusalem.
Dear friends, 1 year ago, we gathered at Yad Vashem some 50 world leaders to renew our shared commitment of remembering the Holocaust and fighting anti-Semitism. Since that historic gathering, we have all experienced a global pandemic. This pandemic has led, on the one hand, to close borders and distance. But on the other hand, it has reminded us of our common humanity and of the need for all countries to work together to meet this challenge. All countries must join hand to defeat the virus of anti-Semitism and radical hate. We must show zero tolerance for all forms of anti-Semitism, racism, and extremism in any country, whether in the streets, online, or in the halls of power. In the fight against anti-Semitism and racism, we must see all tools we have, from research and education to law enforcement. Dear friends, thank you. Thank you again for your commitment to preserving the memory and lessons of the Holocaust. And once again, thank you. Thank you very much. God bless all of you.
Thank you for joining us, President Rivlin. Now, I'd like to turn to the United States and welcome Democratic Congressman Ted Deutsch to the program. Congressman Deutsch represents Florida's 22nd congressional district and is a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, on which he serves as the chairman of the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism Subcommittee. Now, Congressman Deutsch is also co-chair of the House Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, and he's joining us to discuss the need for a whole-of-government approach to combating anti-Semitism wherever it comes from. So, Congressman Deutsch, welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to join the conference. Back in 2014, when we formed the task force, we were witnessing a notable and troubling spike in anti-Semitism incidents in Europe. So the 8 co-chairs, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, decided to invite the ambassadors of France, Germany, and the UK to discuss their government's efforts to address anti-Semitism in their respective countries. Back then, as we focus on what was happening in Europe, I don't think that we'd soon have to turn our attention inward and respond to a growth of anti-Semitism here in our own country. I mean, at around the same time that the task force held this briefing, an association of countries came together under the umbrella of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance to adopt a working definition of anti-Semitism along with examples. And the definition wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It was developed with thousands of years of experience with this age-old hatred. The IRA definition states that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. And to make it even more relevant and applicable today, the authors included examples of modern manifestations of anti-Semitism to help governments in determining what crosses the line. And the definition gives an opportunity to call out modern forms with respect to the state of Israel when it includes as examples what we know is true, that denying the Jewish state, calling for Israel's extermination, claiming that Israel is a racist endeavor, and singularly attacking Israel with rhetoric entirely different than that leveled against other countries, these are modern forms of anti-Semitism. The gunman who killed 11 worshipers on Shabbat morning at the Tree of Life Synagogue was inspired by the xenophobic ideology of white nationalists who believe that Jews were supporting Central American refugees traveling to our southern border in order to take their places. And they picked the Tree of Life Synagogue because they hosted a national refugee Shabbat with Hayas. Here in the United States, we've witnessed a normalization of extremist groups and conspiracy theories that either implicitly or explicitly target Jews. Our country is facing a period where national elected leaders are allowing these dangerous conspiracy theories to spread, even enabling them and refusing to condemn them. And when you welcome a conspiracy theory and extremist ideology in the pursuit of political expediency, you create space for anti-Semitism. You give an open invitation to unseemly characters and groups, some of whom felt so emboldened by this tacit endorsement from their government leaders that on January 6th, they wore their anti-Semitism literally on their sleeve. And when an elected leader makes speeches endorsing anti-Semitic language and theories and supports conspiracy groups rooted in anti-Semitism like QAnon, it contributes to the manifestation of this first IRA example. And when you advance lies and conspiracies about our democratic process and a fairly decided election, conspiracies that are seized on by anti-Semitic extremist groups, it too adds to the form of anti-Semitism laid out in the IRA definition. And similarly, when leaders accuse Jews of being more loyal to Israel than to the interests of America, that fits in to the IRA definition. Or using long-standing stereotypes to make demonizing allegations about Jews and the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, a political operative, or a member of Congress, that contributes to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism left unchecked will only keep spreading. That applies both to anti-Semitism on the political left and on the political right. And we can only effectively fight anti-Semitism if we are willing to call it out wherever it appears. To be consistent, I believe, requires adopting the IRA definition and giving our government the tools needed to protect the American Jewish community. That is an effort that I look forward to continuing to lead. And one last thing. I focused on government and politics in my remarks, but it would be helpful to use this same definition in our society as a whole. For a recent example, if the writers at Saturday Night Live were familiar with this definition, again, developed based on the long history of anti-Semitism in the world, and familiar with the definition's modern examples of what it looks like today, then they and NBC might be in a better position to understand and appreciate why so many of us were so offended by last week's unfortunate attempt at humor. I appreciate the opportunity to join with you and wish you success for the rest of your meeting.
Thank you for joining us, Congressman Deutsch. We're now going to speak with Israeli Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Omer Yankelevich. Welcome to our summit, Minister. Before I ask my first question, I'd like to invite you to say a few opening words.
Thank you very much. Shalom. Thank you. Shalom, President of the State of Israel, Mr. Reuven Rivlin, former U.S. Secretary of State, Mr. Mike Pompeo, Mr. Robert Zinger, Senior Advisor of the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement and Chairman of the Center for Jewish Impact, leaders, friends, and partners. It is a privilege to join all of you today at this annual summit. Just recently, we celebrated the holiday of Purim, where we read about Haman's evil plan to destroy the Jewish people. For over 2,000 years, the Jewish people have served as the scapegoat for the illnesses of the world. The same hatred that drove Haman still exists today. The only way to once and for all put an end to this plague is to stand up against it as a united front. I want to thank the Combat Anti-Semitism movement for initiating and convening this important event, which brings together leaders from across the world to achieve this goal. Thank you.
All right, my first question for you, Minister, is how big of a role do you think the Israeli government should play in combating anti-Semitism around the world?
The State of Israel is dedicated to ensuring the well-being of Jewish life around the world. However, anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It is a global problem requiring a global solution. Last month, the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs published its annual anti-Semitism report, indicating an alarming rise and spread of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And as we know too well, online hatred rarely stays virtual. I want to make clear, each respective country is fully responsible for ensuring the safety and future of their Jewish community. They must take the necessary action to fully ensure that Jewish life in their country is protected both physically and spiritually. While each country naturally focuses within their borders, the unique role of the State of Israel is to take a global perspective. We must not allow for the threat of anti-Semitism to be used as a political tool. Unfortunately, today, this irrational hatred is found among the extreme left and the extreme right, whether it be expressed by hatred of the Jewish people or hatred of the Jewish state. Anti-Semitism must be called out and combated wherever it appears. In addition, creating a global network of communities, countries, and organizations that share resources and best practices is vital. And finally, today there is a lack of information and knowledge regarding anti-Semitism and its dangerous implications worldwide, particularly today. Following the historic Abraham Accords, there is a unique opportunity and willingness in certain parts of the Arab and Muslim world to educate their societies about the Jewish people, their history, and the dangers of anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Minister Yankelevich. I'd like to now turn our attention back to the United States and welcome Republican Congressman Lee Zeldin, who represents New York's 1st Congressional District and is a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman Zeldin, thank you for joining us today. The New York area has faced a spate of anti-Semitic hate crimes in recent years, and what can be done to reverse this trend?
Thank you all for having me, and welcome to this year's Combat Anti-Semitism Movement Yearly Summit. First, I would like to recognize the Combating Anti-Semitism organization, as well as other speakers, some friends, people who I know well, some great Americans. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, former Special Envoy for Anti-Semitism Elon Carr, and Congressman Deutsch and Congressman Gottheimer. We have recently celebrated major progress, securing the Abraham Accords, moving the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, signing the Taylor Force Act into law, and securing diplomat status for the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. But we're not done yet. And it's up to all of us to continue the good work, to continue fighting against anti-Semitism wherever it may rear its ugly head. That's why I support the reintroduction of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. We must also continue urging more countries to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. Some may think this definition is just words, but it is one of the most prominent tools created in recent years for tackling anti-Semitism. This language has been adopted by many countries and bodies around the world. And while this is progress, this definition doesn't have legal teeth. That's why we must fight to have this definition integrated into existing domestic criminal laws, such as hate crimes and discrimination. And we must better enable police and prosecutors to hold culprits of these crimes accountable. This must be our legal mission in not only our domestic laws, but legislative bodies all the way up to the United Nations. I look forward to working together with all of you to continue this mission and combat anti-Semitism at home and all around the world.
Now, I'd like to welcome another special guest from Washington, D.C., Democratic United States Congressman Josh Gottheimer, who represents the 5th District of New Jersey. So, Congressman, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Natasha. It's great to be here. I'm very grateful. And let me say, it is really a privilege to be part of the Combat Anti-Semitism movement for your first ever annual summit. So thank you so much.
Now, Congressman, you were appointed to the House Committee on Homeland Security in January. Can you tell us a bit about your role and your priorities on this committee?
You know, let me just begin by saying that what CAM is doing is phenomenal and doing it in a nonpartisan way. And I just want to thank you for addressing the scourge of anti-Semitism. You know, these days it seems as though the safety and security of our nation is at a critical juncture here in the United States. We face not just threats from international actors like Hamas and Hezbollah and PIJ and ISIS, of course, but increasingly from domestic terrorist groups like white supremacist groups and other homegrown extremists. It's part of what I'm planning to focus on Homeland Security Committee. You know, the rise in violent anti-Semitism and extremism is not just an issue that we know about internationally, but it's something that's in all of our backyards, unfortunately, here in the United States. And on January 6th, when extremists attacked the Capitol wearing hoodies with the words Camp Auschwitz, which we're seeing on social media today. In fact, there's indictments coming down in that case. Or the Proud Boys rally in December, where people were wearing 6 million wasn't enough t-shirts. We see what we're dealing with here. So on the Homeland Security Committee, which I'm very proud to serve, my goal with others is to have an even greater platform in the fight against anti-Semitism, white supremacy, and all forms of bigotry and hatred. And these are issues that I've been focused on for years and that are very impersonal and very personal to me. The committee held our very first hearing on the threat of domestic terrorism in the wake of the attack on the U.S. Capitol. We're laser focused on tackling this threat. I've urged the federal government to officially designate groups like Proud Boys and other international violent extremist groups as terrorist groups. We also want to examine social media, which, as you know, is awash with anti-Semitic and extremist content, something we should all be very focused on, and doing everything we can to help protect our synagogues and religious institutions by expanding programs like the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. Finally, we want to promote important efforts that we believe are critical for the functioning of our democracy, like Holocaust education, genocide awareness, and anti-hate education, all things that I've been focused on since getting into Congress and that we plan to focus on this term.
Now, Congressman, your home state of New Jersey has sadly experienced a troubling rise in anti-Semitism, and particularly, we remember that attack in Jersey City. Can you tell us more, specifically about the rising homegrown domestic security threat that we're seeing with anti-Semitism in your state and in the U.S. as a whole?
I thank you for asking about that, because I vividly remember visiting Jersey City with a good friend of mine, Special Envoy Alon Carr, in the wake of the tragic anti-Semitic attack there, as we've all read about, to stand in solidarity with the Jewish community and others against hate and anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, as the Anti-Defamation League has made clear in their surveys and studies that they do every year, their annual report, in fact, on anti-Semitic incidents, this looking at 2019, stated that anti-Semitic incidents rose 73% in my home state of New Jersey, reaching 345 total incidents, the most ever recorded in the state, and the second highest number recorded in any state across the country. As these incidents and threats continue to grow, both here at home and around the world, online and in our own backyards, we must do everything we can in a concerted action at all levels of government to stop them. In the congressional district I represent, one of the things we've been very focused on, and I've helped claw back $4.1 million back to my district through the Federal Nonprofit Security Grant Program to help protect our synagogues and our yeshivas and our Jewish community centers and all houses of worship, and make sure that they have what they need to stand up against threats of terror. Online, I've led a bipartisan group of members of Congress in calling on Twitter to suspend content affiliated with foreign terrorist organizations, or FTOs, including Hamas and Hezbollah, and keeping them off their platform. And we need leaders, frankly, on both sides of the aisle who are willing to stand up and speak out against anti-Semitism and dangerous conspiracy theories, no matter what the source. So these actions, among others, are things we must continue to take, not just in New Jersey, but of course, across the country.
All right. Thank you, Congressman Gottheimer, for sharing this critically important message with us today. We're going to look forward to following your progress in the House of Representatives. Now, as Israel's ambassador to both the UN and the U.S., Ambassador Gilad Erdan finds himself on the front lines of the global battle against anti-Semitism. Ambassador Erdan, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Natasha. And thank you to the Combat Anti-Semitism movement for organizing this extremely important event and for everything that you do to put an end to the oldest form of hatred. Building an interfaith global coalition against anti-Semitism is crucial to bringing an end to this bigotry. I also want to congratulate Secretary Pompeo for receiving the Global Leadership Award. Your dedication to the safety of the Jewish people and to their homeland is highly appreciated. On behalf of the State of Israel, I thank you for all your outstanding work. On January 20th, 1942, in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, the Nazis met to coordinate the final solution to what they called the Jewish problem. It was as a result of that infamous conference that the extermination camps were established. These camps took the lives of almost 2 million Jews. All 4 of my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, 3 enduring the horrors of Auschwitz. My grandfather Chaim, his wife Bracha, and their 8 children were sent to the camp. The moment they arrived, my grandfather's family was ripped from his arms as the Nazis separated men from women and children from parents. Bracha and 7 of my aunts and uncles were murdered. Only my grandfather and his daughter Hannah survived. The Wannsee Conference, where the fate of many other families was sealed, is the ultimate warning of what can happen when anti-Semitism goes unchecked. It shows that words and hate can easily turn into actions and murder. In January 2022, we will commemorate 80 years since that conference of evil. I have dedicated this year to promoting 2 key initiatives that will enable the UN to prove its willingness to not only speak out against anti-Semitism, but to really take action. The first is for UN bodies to adopt a comprehensive definition of anti-Semitism. By adopting a definition like the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, the UN will have to fight against the anti-Semitism that is prevalent in too many of its bodies, such as UNRWA, as we all know. The second initiative I'm promoting is the adoption of a resolution to effectively address Holocaust denial. Holocaust denial is not only a cynical form of evil that disgraces the memory of victims and the lives of survivors. It is also extremely dangerous. It is used by anti-Semites to get people to forget the horrible consequences of their anti-Semitism. Friends, Iran not only holds the dishonorable title of the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, it also the leading state sponsor of anti-Semitism. Iran's leaders repeatedly use anti-Semitic tropes and openly declare their intention to annihilate the world's only Jewish state. Just imagine what such a dangerous anti-Semitic hate-filled regime would do if it possessed nuclear weapons. And let me be clear, Israel will certainly support a diplomatic solution that definitively prevents Iran from becoming a nuclear state. But it seems today that only a combination of crippling sanctions and a credible military threat can lead to an improved agreement. I was encouraged to hear President Biden express his commitment to preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, and I thank him for his commitment to the safety of Israel and its people. The Abraham Accords, the peace agreements between Israel and 4 Arab countries, is causing a monumental transformation in our region. The recognition of the Jewish people's right to self-determination in the Middle East has allowed the descendants of Abraham to rekindle their ancient connection. This peace is a true model for religious tolerance and coexistence. Not only has it been translated into a real people-to-people peace, with flourishing collaborations in business, science, culture, and academia, it is also a major victory in our fight against anti-Semitism. As Israel's ambassador to the United States, I intend to work with the new administration and our new partners to widen the circle of peace and spread the spirit of coexistence and tolerance throughout the world. Friends, almost 80 years ago, the Nazis planned to annihilate the Jewish people. Thankfully, their plan failed. But unfortunately, the hate and lies that invigorated them are still prevalent. In fact, in the past year, anti-Semitic and racist voices have only grown louder. But this year has also taught us that the truth can and will prevail. The Jewish people and the Jewish state are resilient. We must continue to share the truth and fight against anti-Semitism, racism, and Holocaust denial for the sake of Jews and non-Jews alike. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you all for joining us. It was a pleasure to hear from you, and we're now moving on to the next part of our panel. Now, it's time for us to meet the people who are turning the tide of hate and working tirelessly to end anti-Semitism on the ground. Grassroots activism is one of the key ways to make a real and practical impact in the fight against Jew hatred. And we're honored to host these 4 inspiring activists and hear their stories. Walid Tamtam is a Canadian Muslim of Moroccan descent and a student at New York University. He's committed to bridging community gaps and encouraging interfaith dialogue in the Middle East and North Africa. So Walid, tell us about yourself and your work.
Well, I think that when it comes down to telling the narrative of any community and fighting against the hate of that community, it really matters about what goes on beyond its own community. And for me as a Muslim, growing up, outside of the Jewish community, I think it's very essential that our experiences are known to the Jewish community about how we see them in both good and bad lights, and that we are able to have dialogue with each other and to better understand, really what our true narratives and our true histories are. I think when we don't have opportunities as different communities of religious faith and cultural communities to tell our own stories to other people tell our stories for us, and it's never in the best light possible. And so for me, that's really my whole tale has been about. It's been about getting to get people of different backgrounds to speak to each other. Growing up in Canada is a great opportunity because of our diverse population, but especially coming from Moroccan descent, where we've had our good and bad sides when it comes down to how we dealt with our Jewish community, I felt very inspired and almost of a generational mission statement to continue our goal of really embracing coexistence and being able to, like I said, promote the dialogue between the communities, because that's what really, at the end of the day, allows us to be on the same page of who we are and be able to really push all the hate out.
Thank you, Walid. Now, I'd like to talk with Adela Kojab Moabed, a student at NYU who has led a brave struggle against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on campus and achieved a groundbreaking legal victory. Adela, share your story with us.
Thank you so much. And it's an extreme honor to be here. My name is Adela Kochav. I went to NYU, and I grew up in a small Jewish community where Israel was always a big part of my identity. And I never thought I'd be defending it so publicly on a college campus. I got extremely involved on campus, from student government to Greek life, And suddenly everything turned to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I found myself alone representing Israel on student government, representing the Jewish community against the BDS resolution, another anti-Israel resolution, and a coalition of 53 groups pledging to boycott not only Israel, but the student group representing Israel at the university. I met with administrators multiple times as things were escalating. And after a Yom HaAtzmaut celebration where an Israeli flag was burned by an anti-Israel student and a Jewish NYU student was physically assaulted by an NYU student as well, was anti-Israel, I realized it was time to take action. I spoke to administrators again, who at that point decided to take action. They still believed I was overreacting, but NYPD was involved. 2 students were arrested. A Jewish student was assaulted. My community was scared and angry, and I trusted the school to take action. Instead of actually doing something about anti-Semitism, they gave the same hate group, Students for Justice in Palestine, the President's Service Award, which is the highest award you can get as a group on campus. At that moment, I decided it was time to finally take legal action. At the time, religion was not protected under Title VI, which are discrimination laws in academic institutions. So we knew it was a long shot, but I decided to file. And one day I got a call from the White House. I spoke at a huge conference, and 3 days later, an executive order was drafted to officially include anti-Semitism under Title VI protections. A couple of months later, my case was resolved by NYU, who decided to settle. This is the first case openly addressing anti-Semitism under Title VI, and it's going to be used, hopefully, as a precedent for all other schools who are facing Title VI suits. And what it does is it tells students 2 important things. Number one, your voice matters. Jewish student voices matters the same way that every single other minority student voice matters. And number 2, it tells universities that they have to take Jewish students seriously. I hope to continue my fight on the legal end, and it's really an honor to be here. If you're a student listening to this, don't be afraid to stand up, because even one voice can make a difference.
It's an amazing, amazing story, Adela. Thank you for joining us. Now, our next speaker is Romi Ronen, the president of Students Supporting Israel, or SSI, at Columbia University. So, Romi, you've been a leading voice in advocating for Israel and against anti-Semitic rhetoric on campus. Please tell us about what you've done.
Thank you so much for having me. So I grew up in Manhattan, and as I stepped foot on campus, I noticed that the world outside of my bubble was very different. I didn't really believe or fathom that anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism existed in such an extreme way. The first time I realized there was an immense anti-Semitism problem was when we stood up against the Prime Minister of Malaysia on campus, an effort that was organized by Students Supporting Israel and also Aryeh and Hillel. When I stood up against his anti-Semitic comments, he defended himself by saying it was free speech. His reaction made me so upset that I mentioned my grandmother at the end, who survived the Holocaust. I couldn't believe that I had to use such an extreme example from my life to defend myself and to defend Jewish students on campus as I watched my friend in the crowd crying and breaking down. Obviously, it was important what I did, but it felt horrible after. Why? Because it made me realize that people genuinely don't believe that there's anti-Semitism and certainly don't want to listen when I explain that anti-Zionism grows into a new and more modern form of anti-Semitism that is scary for Jews who feel a need to over-explain a simple notion. The second time I realized there was a problem wasn't actually when I was on campus or in the city, but when I was away from it. During COVID, and especially during the online BDS vote at Columbia, people kept asking me to speak about some of the instances of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, and I realized that the stories that I have are actually really bad, and I just didn't see it at the time. Casually, I would tell people how in middle school, people told me I should find a nice Jewish boy one day or make comments about my nose. In high school, they would tell me my own country doesn't exist, and in college, people would spit at me, push my friends, or call me a Nazi, nationalist, or fascist pig. These things felt normal, but they're not. So what do? I do what I feel. If I feel others have been harmed, or if I've been harmed, I'm usually the first to speak out or write about it. But I learned over time that being behind the scenes is far more important than being at the front of it. Working together with people you may or may not agree with is what actually changes the world for the better. I don't think that my accomplishments consist of published articles or speaking engagements. All of that was necessary, and it became the bare minimum. What I'm proud of is working with people, human individuals, having productive conversation every day and coming to a mutual understanding and conclusion. During COVID, human conversation is the only tool that we have left that is essential. And even if it's one conversation out of 300 that is productive, it's still productive. My hope for the future is that we listen and that we speak. Israel, among other things, saved my grandmother from the Holocaust and saved my grandfather from persecution in Baghdad. Israel means a lot to me, and that's not something that I should be scared to share. Even if you think you're shy, if you have an instinct to speak out, you're not. And if you are, that shyness doesn't come from you, it comes from fear of the outside. But those outsider reactions don't matter. At the end of the day, it's the reaction that you have to yourself that matters, what you've done to own up to what you believe. What you think, what you feel, what you want matters. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for your answer, Romy, and in the work that you're doing. We're going to now speak with Isaac de Castro, the co-founder of Jewish on Campus, a movement that started as an Instagram account to reflect the struggles of Jewish students at American universities and colleges. This account has now become an influential channel for amplifying voices against anti-Semitism on campuses. So, Isaac, tell us about your work.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm Isaac. I grew up in Panama City in a Jewish community where I never worried about anti-Semitism. When I arrived in college, I realized this was a privilege and that in the United States, Jewish students were being suppressed and silenced on college campuses. Because of this suppression that we have been feeling, I, along with other Jewish students online, launched a social media platform, which is called Jewish on Campus, in which we would post anonymous stories exposing this worldwide epidemic festering in our academic institutions. As we've grown, we have become a nonprofit organization, and we have started to launch educational materials as well as the anonymous stories that we have been putting. My message to everyone is that we need to be able to put down these invisible walls that are being put around us, especially Jewish students. The suppression will never be broken down unless we are able to speak out and keep moving forward.
Thank you, Isaac, for telling us about your important work. And all of these activists are a key part of CAM's mission. Their work is deeply appreciated by the organization, and we hope that together we're going to be able to accomplish even more as we strive to create a world that's free of anti-Semitism and bigotry of all forms. Next up, we're going to hear from some of CAM's interfaith partners representing all three Abrahamic religions. Now, it's never been more important than now to build bridges between Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities and to bring together diverse voices to address anti-Semitism and solve our common challenges. Today, amid rising anti-Semitism, we're also witnessing a paradigm shift in the U.S., Europe, and the Middle East. Jewish, Muslim, and Christian leaders are banding together to say enough is enough and to implement creative solutions to end all forms of racism and discrimination. Well, to share their insights on these positive developments, we have with us today Daniel Mariashin, CEO of B'nai Brit International, Susan Michael, the USA Director of ICEJ, and Fiaz Mughal, the founder of Muslims Against Anti-Semitism. So, Mr. Mariashin, let's please begin by telling us about your essential interfaith work that you're undertaking at B'nai Brit International and how your organization is actively building bridges to communities outside of the Jewish world.
Well, B'nai Brit is 177 years old, was founded in New York in 1843, and really since then, we have been working to promote in communities around the world coexistence and to combat bigotry directly by exposing prejudice, but also by advancing an agenda of service to the community. So, for example, we engage in emergency aid and disaster relief on several continents. We promote human rights. We've been at the United Nations since its founding in 1945. We are accredited at the UN Human Rights Council and at UNESCO. We engage in and support legislative initiatives against every form of extremism and bigotry. And we are the leading sponsor of non-sectarian affordable housing for seniors and open to all religions and races here in the United States. We also have an Office of Intercommunal Affairs to develop dialogue and partnership with a diverse spectrum of faith-based and ethnic communities running the entire spectrum, the religious spectrum. We also engage in joint Holocaust remembrance and interreligious programs and Passover services, Seders in Latin America, where we have a very large and extensive membership. And we looked also to empowering the next generation to lead this fight through creativity and inspiration and education. And most recently, together with CAM, with the Combat Anti-Semitism movement, we had our Students Speak Out Against Anti-Semitism, a creative video production contest, which we just finished and just announced our winners. So we're an organization that works in the community. We reach out to our friends in the community, our allies in the community, not only to promote human rights and to promote tolerance, but mutual respect, but also to combat, of course, anti-Semitism.
All right, thank you for that answer. Now, Fiaz Mughal is going to be sharing with us his thoughts on addressing anti-Semitism and the Muslim perspective. So, Mr. Mughal, you've long worked in the interfaith sphere, first for Faith Matters and now as a founder of Muslims Against Anti-Semitism. What is at stake for Muslims in the fight against Jew hatred, and why is it important for Muslims and Jews to stick together in this battle?
Well, it's an essential struggle. And it's an essential struggle because we have two minority communities, one obviously significantly larger than the other. Muslim communities are significantly larger than Jewish communities in Europe, for example. But it's a battle to ensure, and it's a battle to ensure those core values, the human rights values, the respect for each other, the chance to live without being targeted for hate. These are core values that affect both of our communities. Now, the fact is, clearly there are larger numbers of Muslim communities in Europe than there are Jewish communities. But the fact is, the very traditions that I've just spoken about, those values, those fundamental values about human rights, I think within Europe have developed, and history shows have developed because of tragedies, but have developed on the back of Jewish blood, sweat, and tears. And we as Muslims need to, one, acknowledge that, accept some of those rights that we enjoy today are based on the pain that the Jewish community and the struggles they've gone through. The Israel-Palestine debate and conflict has been fueling some of that anti-Semitism in small sections of Muslim communities. We're trying to build up a movement and an informational battle that actually brings Muslims back onto the side of saying, actually, what is the sense of core values we have with other communities? How can we stand with them? How can we be allies with them? And how can we also acknowledge that it doesn't end with anti-Semitism? It starts with anti-Semitism.
All right, thank you for that answer. And last but not least, we're going to be turning the floor over to Susan Michael. So, Ms. Michael, you've been waiting there. Tell us a little bit about your important work at the International Christian Embassy of Jerusalem. How is the ICEJ galvanizing Christians everywhere to stand up for the Jewish people and Israel as well in the face of this widespread anti-Semitism that we're seeing?
Yes, well, thank you so much. Our organization, the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, was born in 1980 out of the Jerusalem issue. That's when all of the embassies moved out of Jerusalem in protest of it being the capital of the state of Israel. And there were a group of Christians that seized that moment and said, we do not support what our governments have done. And so we're starting an international Christian embassy in Jerusalem that represents the millions of Bible-believing Christians around the world for the last 40 years of our existence. We have been involved in many different areas. In Israel, we have humanitarian aid throughout the country. We are very involved in Aliyah and helping bring home immigrants making their way to Israel. We have been very involved with supporting Holocaust survivors, and one of our recent projects is a partnership with Yad Vashem. And so we have been bringing Holocaust education to Christians around the world because that's the second face of our organization, one being to Israel and to the Jewish people, and the other is that we have representation in over 90 countries around the world, and there we're reaching out to the Christian communities to educate and bring an awareness of Israel, the significance of Israel, and the issues surrounding Israel. So we have, as a course of this ministry, this organization, have really played a pioneering role in several areas. And one is just Christian support for Israel, because back in 1980, there were no organizations that existed with that purpose. And so we've really helped to pioneer that. And as a part of that is pioneering a whole new relationship between Jews and Christians, which also didn't exist before that time. And a part of this pioneering of a whole new relationship that many of us are enjoying today, a part of that is educating our own community about the history of Jewish-Christian relations. And part of that is the history of anti-Semitism in the church. And it's a history that many, many Christians do not know.
That was very interesting, and thank you for those insights. Now, Mr. Mariashin, B'nai B'rith is one of the oldest and most experienced organizations in addressing anti-Semitism. In your experience, what is the most important aspect of bringing groups who may have different ideologies together to fight common problems such as anti-Semitism?
Well, I think it was just said earlier that it may start with anti-Semitism, but it doesn't end with anti-Semitism, and that bigotry and intolerance ultimately can infect a society, whether it's a small community or up through nation states and into the international arena. So it's important to send that message about having collective action despite our diversity. I can tell you, I grew up in a small community in New Hampshire where we had only 25 Jewish families within a 25-mile radius. And it was important for us to have friends and to have allies in our efforts to promote mutual understanding and mutual respect. It's also important that we take this to the international level. And one of the groundbreaking events in bringing the international community into this fight against anti-Semitism was the report that was issued about a year ago, the UN report on global anti-Semitism led by the Special Rapporteur on religious freedom, Ahmed Shahid, where he begins to talk about anti-Semitism in a way that really hasn't been discussed at the United Nations or in other international fora. So we have to move at the global level, we have to move at the local level, and to be also concerned about the issues that are affecting other communities within our reach. The Jewish community needs to speak out when other communities have faced discrimination, and being a good critical ally, good ally is extremely important to us. So as we defend the safety of Jews and other minorities in the name of justice and human rights, we build a broader community of like-minded individuals to help in the battle against anti-Semitism. And I think we've seen, even as anti-Semitism has been ratcheted up and has spiked globally, I think we've seen some important developments on the ground. One of them is this CAM summit, of course, which brings us all together to discuss the problem and to work together to defeat it.
All right, thank you for that answer. We have a follow-up question now for Mr. Mughal. It's often been posited that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are two different plagues afflicting contemporary societies. What similarities and differences do you see between the hatred of Jews and the hatred of Muslims? And what can these two religious groups learn from one another in their respective struggles?
Well, it's clear, first of all, that we're talking about an age-old hatred around anti-Semitism. That's the first starting point. It is the oldest form of hatred against a faith community and against a community in general. The second thing I would say is also, look at the numbers. You have I think something in the region of about 26 million Jewish members of the community. I may be wrong with my facts, but you're talking minimal numbers of individuals. Yet you look at the tropes that are associated with them historically, they are so large in number. And so the numbers differ between Muslim and Jewish communities. The history of hate differs between Muslim and Jewish communities. The dynamics around the trigger points of hatred towards Jewish and Muslim communities differ. But with Muslim communities, there will be around migration. Migration is less of an issue around anti-Semitism today than it is for Muslim communities. And then you have the issue of terrorism, which also raises the bar and the ugly head of anti-Muslim rhetoric and anti-Muslim prejudice. And that clearly is not impacting in the way it is because the issue of terrorism doesn't really buffet Jewish communities. And so there are distinct differences, okay? And there are some of the differences. The similarities also, in many ways, are quite strong. The similarities around the form of tropes are sometimes very similar. The sense of othering between that is targeted towards both communities. The sense that they have dual loyalties as a trope which is targeted towards Jewish communities and Muslim communities. The sense that they can't be inherently trusted is another trope that binds both anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred. And the fact that both communities to some degree, historically, culturally, and in terms of their heritage, are trying to undermine these values that some of the haters target towards both of us. So these are the kind of similarities. It is virtually identically the same, because in the end, you know, if they're going to come after Jewish communities, they're coming after us as Muslims. The fact is, and I've said this before, the fact is we as Muslims enjoy some of the basic, decent, common human rights within Europe, within America, within parts of Eastern Europe. We have these basic common denominators of human rights. And that has been based on the suffering of Jewish communities and on their sweat, blood, and tears. And that should inspire my fellow co-religionists as Muslims to stand up for their fellow Jewish brothers and sisters.
All right, thank you for that answer. Now, Dr. Michael, the ICEJ has long given overwhelming support in the fight against anti-Semitism. What should Christians do when they want to support Jews in the face of rising hatred but may not know where to turn? What resources and information are now available to them?
Well, we advise them to do two things, and one is to educate themselves. And so we have built educational resources for the Christian community. We have an educational website called IsraelAnswers.com. It has a whole section on anti-Semitism. And they need to educate themselves to be able to recognize anti-Semitism, where it is, and we are able to couch that so that they also are aware of where it is within the Christian community and what it looks like, what it sounds like. I also recommend that for those that want more is to get on the CAM email list, signing that petition, because the weekly newsletter is really the best resource to know exactly what's happening in anti-Semitism around the world. The second thing that we tell them is to please speak up. One of the painful lessons of the Holocaust is the pain of the silent bystander, that the Jewish people need to hear us speaking up on their behalf and not to feel like you're not going to make a difference. We must speak up. And that means we need to be educated, but sometimes it just means we need to reach out to a Jewish community that may have just come under attack. Say a synagogue was defaced. Send a note card to the rabbi. Just speak out and say, we're very sorry and we stand with you. We're praying for you. We support you. There's two different realms of speaking out. One is just bringing comfort to our friends, the Jewish community, and the other is trying to have a political impact and actually to push back. And that does take a degree of education. And so the resources are there. We're continuing to put out more and more resources because we see that this is a really critical and growing need to educate the people around us.
All right, well, I'd like to thank you all for your time. Your thoughts on addressing anti-Semitism in the interfaith sphere really provide some important lessons out there to everyone who wants to begin building bridges with people of other faiths. Now, I'd like to turn your attention to today's very special award ceremony for a very distinguished guest. The Combat Anti-Semitism Movement is pleased to honor former United States Secretary of State Michael R. Pompeo with its inaugural Global Leadership Award, which is bestowed on individuals who are models of tolerance and mutual responsibility and are forging the path towards a global future of greater interfaith harmony. Now, this award is being given to former Secretary Pompeo by CAM in recognition of his exceptional and groundbreaking contributions to the fight against anti-Semitism and religious prejudice of all forms, and for his deep and steadfast friendship with the Jewish people and the State of Israel, along with his role in helping to craft the Abraham Accords, which have opened the doors for peace in the Middle East. Now, before we speak with the former U.S. Secretary of State himself, I'd like to invite a human rights icon, the former Soviet refusenik Natan Sharansky, to say a few words to introduce this award. So, Mr. Sharansky, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natasha. The aim of Combat Anti-Semitism movement is to establish the front, the global interfaith grassroots front, fighting anti-Semitism all over the world, on all levels of the government and civil society. And the aim of the Leadership Award, or World Leadership Award of our organization, is to recognize those individuals who really came with the new initiatives, initiatives which help to unite people of different faiths and different nations in their struggle against this most ancient hatred, anti-Semitism. And why it is so important today? Because anti-Semitism of all types is growing practically everywhere. And at the same time, polarization inside the countries, between left and right, is growing. And as a result, it's so difficult to build bridges between people of different religious views, or different nations, or different political views, to make united front. And here, Michael Pompeo is the first leader who is, he is the first one who is chosen for our leadership award. Because of Abraham's Accord, you only think it was like shifting paradigm of the idea of how you are bringing peace to the Middle East. For 30 years, for more than 30 years, one after another, leaders were failing to impose peace on the people of the Middle East. The Abraham Accords came from the other side. They are unleashing all this energy of people to people. They are helping the people to express their deep desire for dialogue, for tolerance, for living together in security. You know, I had a privilege to meet with the members of the special Royal Institute of Tolerance, Religious Tolerance of Bahrain, those who signed a special memorandum of understanding with Ilan Carr on behalf of Michael Pompeo. And I told them, are you sure that you understood that what you are signing, it's not only that you will be fighting against hatred against some another Jew, but also against hatred towards Israel? They said, what are you talking about? Of course, not that only we understood, we initiated it. We are going to build secure future in the Middle East. Of course we are against hatred or demonization of Israel. And recently on the Holocaust Day, I was participating in the unique webinar on Holocaust, initiated by Israeli Arabs, but the participants were Arabs from Bahrain and from Morocco and even from Syria. And it's all unbelievable changes. It's only the beginning of those changes who are brought through these Abraham Accords. And of course, Michael Pompeo proved himself as a great friend. He the architect of these accords. And I'm very glad for having this opportunity and to welcome Michael Pompeo and our permanent address in the last years in Washington, Ilan Carr.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that, Mr. Sharansky. You remain an inspiration to human rights activists and the cause for, fighting anti-Semitism and religious freedom all over the world. So we really appreciate you sitting here with us today. And on this note, I'd like to invite Ilan Carr, the former United States Special Envoy for Monitoring and Combating Anti-Semitism. He is here to speak about his experience working with his former boss at the State Department. So, Mr. Carr, you were appointed by Secretary Pompeo to lead the United States' efforts to combat anti-Semitism around the world. Thank you for being with us today, and we'd like to give the floor to you.
Well, thank you so much, and hello, friends. I have the great honor of introducing to you our recipient of the first ever Combat Anti-Semitism Global Leadership Award, my former boss, Secretary Mike Pompeo. Secretary Pompeo has public service in his blood. He graduated first in his class at the United States Military Academy at West Point and served as an Army officer and tank platoon leader. Then, after a successful business career in the Kansas aerospace industry, in 2010, he ran and was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. In January 2017, he left Congress to serve as director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The following year, in April 2018, he was nominated and confirmed to be our Secretary of State. As America's top diplomat, Secretary Pompeo was a tireless advocate for principled American leadership in our world. And this was evidenced in so many ways, not least by his unequivocal commitment to fighting anti-Semitism, protecting the Jewish people throughout the world, and supporting the State of Israel. His accomplishments in this area were unprecedented. He established groundbreaking new policies by declaring that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, that the global BDS campaign is anti-Semitic, and that Israeli settlements are not per se illegal. He helped to lead our historic recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He helped to lead our country out of the disastrous Iran nuclear deal and imposed crushing sanctions on the world's chief state sponsor of anti-Semitism. He convened the first ever US government-sponsored conference on combating online hate. Thanks to him, products made in Israeli-controlled parts of Judea and Samaria are now labeled Made in Israel, and US passports of Americans born in Jerusalem will at long last identify their country of birth as Israel. And then, as Natan said, there are the Abraham Accords, the realization of a decades-long dream of peace between Israel and an increasing number of her Arab neighbors. Secretary Pompeo was one of the architects of that breathtaking transformation that is building a new and better Middle East for all the region's children. All of this and more led the editorial board of a major Israeli newspaper to write that Secretary Pompeo is, quote, a true, consistent, articulate, and unapologetic friend of the Jewish state. The editorial went on to declare that he is, quote, one of the best friends Israel has ever had as Secretary of State. Now, I know personally that for Secretary Pompeo, the cause of protecting the Jewish people and supporting the State of Israel is a deeply felt passion, stemming from deeply held convictions. His leadership has made an enormous difference, and I could not have been more proud to serve on his team. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege to present to you the 70th Secretary of State of the United States of America, Michael R. Pompeo.
Elon, thank you. What a kind introduction. It's wonderful to see you again. We did amazing work together in combating anti-Semitism around the world. I'm really proud of what we did, and we had a president that would let us do it. It's humbling to be on the same stage with you, Mr. Sharansky. I've read your work, I've watched your work for an awfully long time, and your cause has been noble. I can see you are still hard at it. Know that I am too. And thank you all. Thank you for this award. There were lots of hands that went into making this happen. Lots of hands here in the United States. It wasn't just me. It wasn't just Elon. It took a big group of people who were committed to this in a deep and personal way. We had that. But then it took people all across the world. I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about this. You mentioned the Bahrainis. It took real leaders who were prepared to acknowledge the central set of understandings about this special place of Israel being the rightful homeland of the Jewish people, and preserving and protecting Jews wherever they are around the world from the hatred and anti-Semitism that has scarred so much of our recent history. There's obviously lots more work to do. I intend to stay hard at it, but thank you so much for honoring me today by allowing me to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
All right. Well, of course, it's a pleasure to have you, and we're going to be able to ask you some questions shortly. But first, I would like to turn everyone's attention to a short video segment in which we explore the very reasons behind this year's Global Leadership Award recipient. Take a look.
Let me go on record. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
30 days from now, all the sanctions that were in place will resume, and the world will be a safer place. With the dark wave of anti-Semitism rising in Europe and in the United States, all nations, especially those in the West, must go to the barricades against bigotry. We will regard the global anti-Israel BDS campaign as anti-Semitic. Welcome, everyone. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo here. It's a pleasure to speak with you, alongside so many important leaders from the United States and from our allies all around the world. Nowadays, bigots everywhere can spread anti-Semitism anonymously online. They ludicrously blame the Jewish people for the spread of COVID-19. Today I'll get a chance to visit the Golan Heights. The simple recognition of this as part of Israel, too, was a decision President Trump made that is historically important and simply a recognition of the reality. We're also gravely concerned about the threat the court poses to Israel.
The Combat Anti-Semitism movement recognizes former United States Secretary of State Michael R. Pompeo for his exceptional and groundbreaking contributions to the fight against anti-Semitism and religious prejudice of all forms, his deep and steadfast friendship with the Jewish people and State of Israel, and his role in crafting the Abraham Accords, which have opened the doors for peace in the Middle East and created new allies in the battle against the world's oldest hatred. We are pleased to honor Mr. Pompeo with the first ever Combat Anti-Semitism Global Leadership Award, bestowed on exemplars of the values of tolerance and mutual responsibility who are forging the path toward a global future of greater interfaith harmony.
As we just witnessed, former Secretary Pompeo has been a steadfast ally in the struggle against anti-Semitism. And now it's my honor to introduce former United States Secretary of State Michael Pompeo, who's joining us in the studio today live for an exclusive interview about his work to combat anti-Semitism. Now, Secretary Pompeo, welcome and congratulations on receiving this important CAM Global Leadership Award. Now, you're not Jewish, and there aren't many Jews in the Kansas district that you represented in Congress. Yet when you became Secretary of State, you not only made a point of filling the anti-Semitism envoy position, which had been vacant for over a year at that point, but you also added several deputies and elevated the office as an important branch of the State Department. So why was this so important for you to take these steps? As a non-Jew, why do you believe that tackling anti-Semitism is so important?
Well, Natasha, I've been at this for a long time. Long before I entered government service, I knew the importance of Israel to the United States as a security partner, and I knew the history of the hatred of Jewish people. We all know the history from World War II and the Holocaust. Something that's deeply personal for me. When I was a young cadet at West Point now, too long ago, I studied the wars 1967 and 1973. I'm an evangelical Christian who has taken great interest in reading the history of the Hebrew Bible as well. I've come to know that this place, Jerusalem, and this land is so special to so many around the world. And to see anti-Semitism rise, to see the risk that it presents to the Jewish people is something that no one, no American, no one anywhere in the world ought to tolerate. And so when I got this chance to serve as America's Secretary of State, I knew I wanted to use every moment that I had, every energy that the State Department could bring to bear on this. So I built out a team. Elon came to lead it. We built out a big team that worked on this alongside with Ambassador Brownback, who was working on a broader set of religious freedom issues as well. We understood that if we didn't get this right, if we sloughed off, if we allowed this to be something that wasn't prioritized inside of the United States government, that the risk to the Jewish people and the Jewish homeland would increase. So it was something that was important for me personally as a man of faith, but also something my duty to the United States and my moral obligation to people of all faiths around the world understood that we had to get this fight against anti-Semitism right, and we needed to put every piece of energy we had into that fight.
Now, after a gunman attacked a synagogue in Halle, Germany, you made a point of visiting the temple. And last Yom Kippur, while you were in Greece, you also made a point of visiting with the Jewish community in Saloniki. What insights did you gain seeing these small European Jewish communities that have faced vicious anti-Semitism in the past and in the present?
So Halle, Germany was very special to get a chance to go there and to visit the synagogue and to sit down with the leaders there. They had just been through a horrific tragedy. I got a chance to pray with them and to be with them. And I wanted the world to see that America's Secretary of State was watching, we were counting, we were measuring. As a special place too, because Germany has a unique history with respect to anti-Semitism as well. So it was really important for me to go there and express America's sympathy with the people who had suffered such a great tragedy, but also to make the case for how we were going to combat this and how we were going to protect this kind of thing from happening again. Salonika is another example. This was a small, historic European community inside of Greece. I had a chance to go visit them and see their small museum, which traces the history of European Jewry. I've known this history from friends. You talked about there being a small community in Wichita. It's true, but these are important people of faith, and we wanted to make sure always and protect and preserve even that community in Wichita, Kansas. We wanted to make sure they had a place to safely worship and to practice their faith in the way that they desired to practice it. And so whether you're in Kansas or in Greece or in Germany, it's always important for American leaders to get out and to be with the Jewish people and express our support and express that we are working diligently to do all that we can to combat anti-Semitism wherever we find it, whether it's the most vicious form in attacks like we saw in Germany or the softer forms of anti-Semitism we see in our schools and in our communities all across the world today.
All right. Now, I'd like to turn to the Abraham Accords. Obviously, this is a topic that we have mentioned already several times, but for decades, the Middle East was arguably the main place where overt anti-Semitism flourished. But now the Abraham Accords has brought a sea of change in the region. In a sense, the old Arab-Israeli conflict is over, and it's creating new opportunities to advance philo-Semitism. So how optimistic are you about the long-term implications of these accords? And do you think that they're going to lead to reduced anti-Semitism and greater religious tolerance in the region?
So I'm incredibly optimistic. There's so much to say about these accords. But without focusing on the accords themselves for just a minute, what Mr. Sharansky spoke to is exactly right. Look, for an awfully long time, for decades and decades, in U.S. foreign policy, and frankly in European foreign policy as well, there was a central understanding. It was this: if you cannot resolve once and for all, and in its totality, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, no dice. You can't advance peace, you can't advance stability, the Arab-Israeli conflict will continue. If you can keep there from being a war or an intifada, so much the better, but you're not going to fundamentally make any significant change. The great news is that was just all wrong. The bad news is it took us 2 or 3 decades to figure our way through that. It took President Trump and our team to acknowledge that, no, you could build peace, you could build stability, and you could do so even while trying to impart a better situation between Israel and the Palestinians. But if that conflict couldn't be resolved, if the Palestinian leadership continued to say no and no and no, then we were going to move on and forward and allow people from other places in the Middle East, other Arabs, to say, no, we don't want to base our relationship with Israel on hatred. We don't want to base it on anger. We don't want to simply say that we're going to allow the Palestinians to deny us the capacity to have a relationship with Israel. And they did it. They did it because it's right for their people. They did it because it's the morally appropriate thing to do. What you'll see, I think, and why I'm optimistic is because I think now we've unleashed this. I think this is happening. It took an American leadership team that was prepared to help facilitate it, but now I think it will stand the test of time. I think people in these places aren't going back. The people in Sudan, the people in Bahrain, the people in the Emirates, in each of these places. Now Morocco has begun to allow more to take place. The Saudis have now allowed a much more open set of relationships. I think you're going to see people in this region simply say, look, The Jewish homeland of Israel is rightful. It's appropriate. We want them to be diplomatic friends. We want them to be economic partners. We want them to be security allies. And I think you will begin to see this grow and grow and grow and take on a momentum. And I am hopeful. I'm hopeful one day that this momentum will allow the people that live alongside Israel, the Palestinians, to see that they too must get on board with this. I hope, and I know we'll talk about this later, I'm sure we will, I hope we see the people in the most anti-Semitic nation in the world today, in Iran. I hope the people of Iran come to see this is the right thing to do and cease to chant death to Israel and death to the United States, but rather welcome them into this union that simply recognizes the rightful place of the Jewish people in the homeland in Israel. I'm very optimistic.
So we're going to get to the future, but as someone who was there on the front lines as these accords were coming together, what changes did you see firsthand? Take us inside the room, to better understand these breakthrough negotiations. Are there any key aspects of the peace diplomacy that the public doesn't fully appreciate at this point?
Oh, there's a bunch. I think first, there was a reason it took 3 decades. There was lots of resistance to what it was we were trying to accomplish. There was resistance in the U.S. policy community that said, you can't do this until you get it right. And so we began, if you'll recall, with a meeting in Warsaw, Poland, where we, for the first time, Prime Minister Netanyahu attended, foreign ministers from the Gulf states attended. They were in the same place. They were in the same room. It was absolutely historic. It was underreported. But that was the moment when I knew I could see the goodwill and commitment on both sides, on the Israeli side and on the Arab side, to figure our way through this thing. And in a special place, a place with so much history, in Warsaw, Poland, the Polish government was wonderful to have hosted that event. It was the very beginning of the set of understandings that culminated in the Abraham Accords. But the resistance didn't just come from the U.S. foreign policy establishment. The Russians would have preferred this didn't happen. There were quarters in Europe that would have preferred that this did not happen. They wanted to hold out. They wanted to maintain the fiction that this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians was the end-all and be-all for the Middle East and Middle East stability. But once that shibboleth was destroyed, once you could see that you could do these things and there wouldn't be World War III, there wouldn't be another intifada, when leaders came to see that we could piece this together, we could patch this together and create warm relationships between these nations, you could see the diplomatic efforts begin to thrive and grow. And you could see people of faith, from Christians to Jews to Muslims, come to understand this was the right approach. It was the path forward for Middle East stability, and that there was the possibility that we could achieve this moment. It took many, many months. It took lots of meetings. It took great leadership from leaders in the Emirates and in Bahrain and elsewhere. They had to be bold. We had the right people in the right places working on the right problem set at the right moment, and it came together in a set of historic understandings that will change the face of the globe for decades and decades to come.
We obviously have to ask, I think that everybody has been wondering this, which Muslim country do you think is going to be the next to normalize ties with Israel? Perhaps Saudi Arabia?
I'm really bad at predictions. I'm good at grinding through problem sets, but predicting the future has proven a struggle for me. I don't think there'll be just one. I think there'll be many more. I hope that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia can find its way to join the Abraham Accords. I know many inside that country want that to take place, but there are other nations too that can join all of those countries, right? I hadn't mentioned Jordan and Egypt that have reached their own separate peace with Israel as well. We need every country all across the world. Muslim nations, not just in the Middle East, but places like Indonesia as well. I'm confident that through time they will make the right decision for their people, they'll make the right decision for Israel, and indeed the right decision for the world.
Now, let's turn to Iran, another issue that is making the headlines consistently. The regime in Iran continues to threaten Israel with destruction. The Pakistani Supreme Court just freed Daniel Pearl's murderer. Anti-Semitism is on the rise on both the far left and the far right, and not to mention rampant Islamist anti-Semitism. What concerns you the most when you look at the latest anti-Semitic trends that we're seeing in both the United States and abroad, and what do you attribute this rise in anti-Semitism to?
Well, there's kind of two different questions in there. I'll take the second one first. So this rise in anti-Semitism is something that is deeply troubling. We saw it from the left, political left, not just the political left in the United States, but the political left all across the world, including in the United States and Europe. We also saw it from the right, but from wherever it comes, or if it's Islamist anti-Semitism, wherever it emanates from, we across the world, people of faith all across the world, from whatever religion, have an obligation to do our best to stamp it out. And while we have made progress, we still have institutions, educational institutions, institutions all across the world that haven't come to the same understanding, and we need to make sure they get the attention and the education right, so that they understand that these historic myths, these stories that seem to continue to perpetuate themselves, are knocked down and the truth is told once and for all. You began the question with Iran.
Yes.
The Abraham Accords would not have happened. It was not possible for them to happen without the United States changing its policy with respect to Iran 180 degrees from how the previous administration had addressed that issue. The previous administration had decided to make a deal which addressed a singular component of the threat from Iran, its nuclear program, and even with respect to that singular component, had frankly created an inevitable pathway for a nuclear weapon for the Iranians. We came in and just flipped the script. And absent that, absent convincing Arab states all across the region that the United States was serious, that we would defend them and their interest when necessary, and that we were going to hold the Iranians accountable for the threats that they posed, not only to Israel, but the threat that they posed to Kuwait, the threat that they posed to Oman, the threats that they posed to the Saudis, to the Emiratis, to people all across the region, that the United States was going to address this threat. I don't think it would have been possible for their leadership to enter into these historic accords. And so we did. I remember being told, America can't go this alone. American sanctions won't work. Well, ask the Ayatollah, ask Javad Zarif, ask Rouhani if our sanctions worked. They worked tremendously. And we put real pressure on the Iranian regime and denied them resources to underwrite Hezbollah, to underwrite Shia militias in Iraq, to underwrite their activities in Syria. We denied them an enormous amount of money. They now say they want $1 trillion in reparations from this administration to go back into the deal. $1 trillion, okay, fair enough. We cost them $1 trillion. That pressure reduced the risk of terror throughout the region, and America was strong. When Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, responsible for so much mayhem and so much risk, and the risk of death to people all across the region, killed hundreds of Americans. When Qasem Soleimani threatened the United States of America, President Trump was prepared to do the right thing, and we killed him. And we took out a general who had been responsible for so much harm throughout the region. I think when leaders in the Arab world saw that the United States was prepared to do this, to push back against Iran, to push back against the IRGC leadership in the person of Qasem Soleimani, they knew they had a friend and a partner, and they knew that they could proceed down a path which their people wanted and work against anti-Semitism and build out a set of accords with the state of Israel. These are not disconnected issues. They are deeply connected. One could not happen without the other. And our holistic approach to how we thought about the Middle East has led to this historic opportunity that the Israelis now have and Arab states now have to join together to make a stronger, more stable, more peaceful, and more tolerant Middle East.
Now, we'd like to turn to your career more specifically and kind of get a sense about what it was like. What were two key defining moments in your tenure as Secretary of State where you had to make bold decisions that weren't easy, and how did you navigate those decisions?
Well, goodness, one of the things that was the most complex was the conversations we had with Chairman Kim. I began them when I was actually the CIA director on a clandestine trip that I took on Easter of 2000, and I think it must have been 2018. The president knew that the nuclear threat from North Korea was real. You'll remember we were all pretty fired up. The president tweeted about fire and fury. We are attempting to reestablish deterrence with the North Koreans who were continuing to conduct missile tests. And so to go and travel to Pyongyang to meet with Chairman Kim, to try to deliver on the president's diplomatic efforts, again, was something that, frankly, few administrations would have done. To have a summit between these two leaders was something that was incredibly challenging and I think defined the way we approached the world. The meetings didn't ultimately end in exactly the outcome we would have hoped, but there still hasn't been a long-range missile test. There still haven't been nuclear tests from North Korea. Chairman Kim has lived up to those promises. There obviously remains more work to do. But we grounded this in reality, the reality of where North Korea was, and we did the same in the Middle East. You know, the second one I alluded to already. I remember those who said we couldn't move the embassy to Jerusalem. And I remember the opposition inside the United States government as well that said, no, a strike against Qasem Soleimani will inflame the region. But in fact, did just the opposite. We recognized the reality of Jerusalem as the rightful homeland of Israel, as the Golan Heights, appropriately contained inside of the state of Israel. Those central facts, recognition of those, took real strength from a president. It took real effort on behalf of the State Department to deliver on those outcomes in a way that established what I think the world needs: strength, clarity, transparency, the willingness to deter, the capacity to take a strike when necessary, to be restrained when it's not. Those are the things I think that will define the 4 years of President Trump and my time as CIA Director and Secretary of State. And I hope many of those things, those central understandings of the reality of how foreign policy can deliver good outcomes for America and the world, I hope those will remain.
All right. Well, on that note, congratulations again, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for all that you have done to ensure the future of religious tolerance and interfaith harmony, especially here in Israel.
Thank you. Thank you for being such a good friend of our people and of our country. And thank you for choosing Ilan Carr as our partner and our address for many years. Thank you.
It's been made clear today that there's not just one way to fight anti-Semitism, but rather there are a multitude of innovative paths for people to get involved. Since its founding, CAM has promoted the activities of an inspiring community of young grassroots activists from around the world who have used their creative skills to take on discrimination and celebrate those who have stood up for the Jewish people. Now, these next incredible individuals who you're about to hear from were winners of CAM contests and have used their ingenuity and CAM's platform to take a stand and make sure that their messages are heard. Zachary Singerman is the founder of Gen Z Jews, an organization that's on a mission to rally his generation against anti-Semitism. So, Zach, tell us a little bit about your partnership with CAM, what led you to start Gen Z Jews, and how you're addressing anti-Semitism within your generation.
So my partnership with CAM has been really just an incredible experience. They have helped me on so many levels with, first off, giving me grant money to start up my organization and get some incredible speakers at my summits. And they've really just been helping me on every stage through creating the webinars that I'm using, through helping me with the flyers, and really just things like that, and everyone who has helped me in the process. And so I started Gen Z Jews because of the Tree of Life shooting. And that was very personal to me because that was my grandma's synagogue. And luckily she wasn't there that day, but it really made me realize that I had to do something because I don't want to live in a world where anti-Semitism keeps growing and growing and it becomes out of hand more than already is right now. And I really try to combat this through my organization, where we're trying to educate Gen Z and we're trying to get them really to fight against anti-Semitism at our young age so that we don't end up living in that world where there is extreme, like even more extreme forms of anti-Semitism than there are now. And so like, that's really what we're trying to do. We're just trying to educate and make people really join and want to join the fight against anti-Semitism.
Well done, Zach. You give us a lot of hope for the future. And I'm going to turn to our next guest now. That's Juri, a CAM contest winner and Japanese-American muralist who recently completed a painting in tribute to Chiune Sugihara, a Japanese diplomat who saved thousands of Eastern European Jews during the Holocaust. So, Juri, what inspires your work? How has winning CAM's contest furthered your art? And what is the importance of addressing anti-Semitism through creative outlets like painting?
Hi, everyone. Well, my work is inspired by poignant stories, actually, that I hear. Sometimes the stories are from Japanese history or my culture. And sometimes they're inspired by my travels. I travel a lot. I've been able to travel and paint in Israel also with another organization called Artists for Israel. And I've met so many brave people there, and it has inspired some paintings with Jewish themes of bravery. I did a mural of Hannah Senish, and I've done a piece of an Ethiopian Jew, an IDF soldier, and now the piece that I've done most recently of Sugihara Chiune. So winning the Emma Lazarus Award, at first we were going to do it as a mural, but because of COVID, we had to adapt. And instead, I made a giant painting in my dining room that was as big as a mural. And thanks to Cam's webinars, I've been able to share it with so many people, hundreds of people who have been watching, and it's been shared on social media networks so many times. And I've gotten so many good responses, including lots of Japanese people that said they've never heard this story before. And once they read it, they were just so overwhelmed with hope. And they said, this is the pride of Japan to have a story like this. So I think as for the importance of fighting anti-Semitism in art, unfortunately, with street art and popular culture, anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment has become very trendy these days. And unfortunately, I think this trend is largely based on misinformation and lies. So with my art, I hope that people can see the truth that I'm trying to tell from having been to Israel and traveled all around and listened to people. So I hope they'll be drawn to the beauty in my art and be drawn to ask about the story instead of just believing a popular narrative that they've heard somewhere. My name in Japanese actually means submit to the truth. So I'd love to keep painting themes of beauty and truth for people to enjoy and learn from.
Well, Judy, thank you so much. I've seen your artwork. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And your piece on Sugihara was so inspirational. It really, ensured that this important piece of history is not forgotten. Now, finally, our last contest winner is Madeline Stern. Madeline Stern is a junior at Broadneck High School in Arnold, Maryland. She was the winner of the Students Speak Out video contest organized by CAM and B'nai B'rith International. So, Madeline, tell us what made you submit a video to the contest and what you learned about yourself and anti-Semitism along the way.
Certainly. Thank you for your question. So I'm a Jewish teenager living in the United States, and I have experienced anti-Semitism. In middle school, I was constantly picked on, cursed at, and told insulting jokes about the Holocaust by 2 boys. I ignored them for a period of time, but I finally had enough. I could not keep sitting by silently and decided to report them to my school's administrators. Then the bullying stopped. This experience stuck with me. When I heard about the Students Speak Out Against Anti-Semitism creative video contest sponsored by B'nai B'rith International and the Combat Anti-Semitism movement, I immediately knew it was something in which I wanted to take part. I have been personally affected by anti-Semitism and wanted to let people know that they are not alone, while hopefully giving them the strength to stand up to the hate. Throughout the video production process, I learned that we truly have the power to make change, and my worldview expanded as I came into contact with people from all corners of the globe. Berk from Turkey, Esther from Estonia, Liza from Ukraine, and many others shared their devastating stories in my video, Anti-Semitism is Everywhere, Stop the Hate. The video features 30 teens from 14 different countries, not to mention the dozens of other teens that I spoke with along the way. Each one of these young people had a story about being attacked, belittled, or discriminated against. Their stories are bone-chilling. They give you a personal, intimate example of the hate that is directed at Jews. Hearing about their experiences made me feel sad and angry. As I see story after story in the news about vandalized synagogues, stabbings on the streets, the double standard applied to Israel, anti-Semitism, I feel sad and angry. How can our world be full of such hate? How could other human beings treat other human beings in such a deplorable manner? But there is hope. In my video, for example, people literally from everywhere came together to spread the powerful message of speaking out against anti-Semitism. On a broader scale, an example includes how Arab countries are now making peace deals with Israel, a feat that was once considered unattainable. To make even greater strides in stopping the hate, we must do 3 primary things. We must educate others, we must stand up, and we must speak out. Many people have thanked me for making my video. They were shocked to learn about the hate Jewish people experience. If we can teach the youth of today about anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, we can work toward a more peaceful world for the leaders of tomorrow. Additionally, we must stand up. I learned this firsthand. The second I stood up to the ignorant boys at my middle school and got administration involved, the bullying stopped. While it can be scary standing up to a person who wants to see you suffer, we must. And when you stand up against the hate, speak out. If people understand that their actions are hateful and ignorant, they could be more informed and view people in a more accepting way. If we remain silent, the hate will become normalized and spread. All of us would love to see the day where anti-Semitism no longer plagues society. It is a goal we are working towards. By educating others, standing up, and speaking out, we can stop anti-Semitism and all other forms of bigotry. By performing these actions, we can practice the Jewish principle of tikkun olam and do our part to repair the world.
All right, Madeline, thank you so much for that powerful statement. And to hear what goes on behind the scenes of a production like this is very, very interesting, particularly getting so many young people to participate. That certainly probably wasn't easy. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, and congratulations on your important work. It's fair to say that the Abraham Accords have completely changed the face of the Middle East and North Africa. The normalization of ties between Israel and several of its Arab neighbors, including the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, have shifted the paradigm in the region. What was once unimaginable is now reality, and Jewish-Muslim relations will likely never be the same. Even just last summer, who would have thought that tens of thousands of Israeli tourists would soon be flocking to the beaches and shopping malls of Dubai? Well, to share their insights on these rapid geopolitical developments, we have with us today Morocco's ambassador to the United Nations, Omar Hilali, and former top U.S. diplomat Ambassador Dennis Ross. But first, we're going to turn the floor over to Jason Guberman, the executive director of the American Sephardi Foundation, for a few words. Jason?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So the American Sephardi Federation is a founding partner and integral organization within the Center for Jewish History. Our mission is to preserve, promote, and perpetuate the history, traditions, and rich Mosaic culture of the greater Sephardic communities. The ASF is a library, an archive, historical, and cultural organization. We represent the Sephardic voice in Jewish communal and diplomatic affairs. In the past year, the Combat Anti-Semitism movement has exceeded our expectations in every way, as it has grown to ever more effectively fight anti-Semitism. We are proud to have been one of the first organizations to partner with CAM and to be joined by our friends, such as Association of Mimuna in Morocco and MANI, the Moroccan Americans in New York, who were the first Muslim-majority organization in America to sign the Combat Anti-Semitism Pledge. Mimuna has recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the U.S. Department of State that canonizes the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism with its crucial examples. Last summer, with CAM and the ASF, honored the Muslim World League's Secretary General, Sheikh Dr. Mohammed Al-Isa, with the first CAM ASF award for a Muslim leader who has courageously and creatively countered anti-Semitism, as well as fought against all forms of hate, bigotry, and fanaticism. Muslim-Jewish relations begin with the friendship of Rabbi Muhayrik and the Prophet Muhammad, and the rabbi's martyrdom in the service of the Prophet's cause. The fact that this is probably the first time many of our viewers have ever heard of Rabbi Muhayrik's name, no less have any idea of his accomplishments, represents the shroud of Jahiliyyah, or ignorance, that has descended on the region in recent decades, and is just now beginning to clear thanks to the visionary and moral leadership of the Kingdom of Morocco, of the United Arab Emirates, of the Kingdom of Bahrain, and Sudan. This is a new era, but one that is rooted in history. The Middle East is the heartland of Jewish history, the home to our prophets, our historical and our holy sites. Greater Sephardic Jews were once one of a plethora of peoples who made Cairo, Tyre, Aleppo, and Baghdad bustling hubs for trade and innovation. The Abraham Accords, and again, this is going to sound very strange for people who have this stereotype of the region. The Abraham Accords represent a reassertion of classical Middle Eastern values of moderation, pluralism, and future-mindedness by recognizing the rightful place of Israel in the region and the rightful history of Jews in the region. At the same time, there is a struggle for the heart and soul of the Middle East going on right now. there is the pluralist past and the possibility of a pluralist future. And in between, there was the force of Islamists and Arab National Socialists who conspired to eliminate minorities and destroy that pluralist possibility. Today, we're faced with Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, the Iranian regime, and many other challenges in the region that could conspire again to prevent peace, prosperity, and progress. It is our hope, working together with our very good friends in the region, to stand with them, those who have the courage to oppose anti-Semitism and to oppose these forces together to achieve that future that's in the offing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. I now have the honor of introducing the Moroccan ambassador to the United Nations, Omar Hilali, and former top U.S. diplomat, Ambassador Dennis Ross. So, ambassadors, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. And first, Ambassador Hilali, I'd like to ask you, Morocco and Israel have long had behind-the-scenes contacts. Why was it important to now bring those relations out into the open and officially normalize ties?
Before answering your question, I would like to stress one very important point, is that the Moroccan Jewish community is an ancient community, and their presence dates back over 2,500 years on the time of the Carthaginian state. And that the domination of the Romans in the 17th century, Jewish settled in Morocco alongside with Moroccan Amazigh. They adopted their language and lived harmoniously with each other since then. So the existence of Jewish people is a part of our history, part of our roots. Jewish people is not a minority in Morocco. They are just considered as Moroccans. You ask now why we are not working behind the scene. I can assure you that we have been working and getting contact with Jewish people in Israel, with officials also. I would like to remind that Morocco was involved and was the initiator of the peace process between Egypt and Israel. So politicians and Morocco played very important role when there was no contact between Arab states and Israel in the Middle East. And we have so many people visiting Morocco from Israel and Israelis visiting Morocco. And we are very proud to have this very important community of almost 1 million. It's the second community in Israel who are keeping strongly their links with Morocco and are building very strong bridges also between Israel and Morocco. The exchange and the contribution of Israeli technology in agriculture is very known and very appreciated for decades. So talking about normalization between Morocco and Israel, for me, the term normalization is not correct. We can't say reconnecting or relinking, because the link have never been broken. The difference is that there was maybe a formal relationship, but there was a lot of trust, a lot of confidence, because Morocco from the beginning was acting and working thanks to the King Hassan II and now the present King Mohammed VI, genuinely and sincerely for the peace between Arabs, Palestinians, and Israelis. And the fact that we are reopening our embassy or our representation now that is another talking about our commitments. So for us, it's just continuity of what the kind of relationship that we have. People trust us to be the honest go between Arab states and Israel. And Israel also was cooperating with Morocco in so many fields. And when I'm talking about multilateral, it means that Morocco have been all the time having very fruitful, very engaged, and very honest relationship with Israel. And for us, it's not complex because we believe in peace. We believe in our imperative of living together, and we believe that peace cannot be in our region without having all the people living and coexisting and accepting each other in the same area.
All right, thank you for that answer. Now, Ambassador Ross, my first question for you is similar to what I asked the Moroccan ambassador, but on a broader scale. Why now? Why all of a sudden are all of these Arab countries going public with their relations with Israel?
Well, I think there's a number of factors, but let's put it in a certain context. There has been a relationship that has been developing between a number of Arab states and Israel for some period of time. The truth is, below the radar screen, it was already emerging in the 1990s, once you had the Oslo process and once you had prior to that, the multilateral working groups. Once the PLO, for example, was prepared to deal with Israel, many Arab states, not counting Morocco, because as the ambassador said, Morocco had this long-standing relationship. Morocco played this fundamental role in terms of bringing Egypt and Israel together. But many other Arab states began to have a connection for the first time. Now, over time, the preoccupation with common views of security threats began to change things. There's no question that if you take a look at the reality of strategic threat perceptions as it related to specifically Iran, as it related to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, for some of the states, especially in the Gulf, as it relates to how they perceive the Muslim Brotherhood, Israel was seen as a natural strategic partner. But that produced, in most cases, cooperation below the table. What we've seen, and this is really the heart of your question, why is it being raised above the table now? Now, one of the precipitating events, ironically, in the case of the UAE, is that the UAE made a decision that they wanted to continue to pursue the process of normalization, which in their case began more than a decade ago. They were already publicizing certain parts of it. They allowed the Israelis to establish a diplomatic office in Abu Dhabi in 2015 in the International Renewable Energy Agency. They were going, prior to COVID, they were going to allow the Israelis to have their own pavilion at Expo 2020 prior to the time of formal normalization. The precipitating move in their case was they made a decision that they wanted to prevent Israel from annexing the territories allotted to it under the Trump peace plan. And so the Emiratis came to the Trump administration and said, look, we can give you a win. We can give you the first peace treaty since the Jordan peace treaty with Israel in 1994. But in return for that, we'll do full normalization, we'll do a peace agreement, we'll do a peace treaty, but no annexation. And we want you to address some of the security concerns we have to get weapons that we haven't had we've been denied because of the American commitment to Israel's qualitative military edge. So the Trump administration made a decision to go for that. Once the UAE kind of crossed that threshold, it certainly opened the way for others, at least psychologically. But I think it also reflected something else. It didn't mean that the Palestinian cause was forgotten, but it did mean that for most Arab states, for most Arab leaderships, their priority was pursuing their own national interests.
Now, Ambassador Hilali, I'd like to turn back to you. There's a long, rich Jewish history in Morocco. You mentioned this. Do you think that the Abraham Accords will lead to greater tolerance for Jews throughout the Middle East and North Africa? And while establishing diplomatic ties is, of course, a great first step toward a more peaceful future, how do you build people-to-people ties and eliminate long-standing hostility that still exists on the streets?
I think to build people-to-people links, we need to start with our own country. What we need is very warm peace, very fruitful, very beneficial to both sides. And as Ambassador Ross just said, that there is the national interest of every country. And every country, of course, now is looking to see which kind of dividend the relation with Israel will bring to its people, to its country, to its security. But beside that, what is needed is education, educating people about coexistence. More than coexistence, because personally, I don't think that coexistence is enough. What we need is accepting the other, accepting its difference, accepting its religion, its belief, educate our children, and to show that Jewish people is part of our components, is part of our DNA. And to educate people, we need to not only to talk about history, but also to talk about their contribution, the contribution of the Jewish people to the civilization, the culture, and development of Morocco. That's why His Majesty the King Mohammed VI took 3 or 4 very important and very strong and symbolic decision, which show that Morocco is very attached to its legacy. First of all, renaming the streets and the places in different cities of Morocco with their origin name, Jewish name. The second was to inaugurate what His Majesty called the House of Memory. And I think our friend Jason was there when this inauguration was in Sawera. It's like a museum where we discover the history, the legacy, and the common history that Muslims, Moroccans, and Jewish have on the land of Morocco. The third is now in the curricula in the universities and in the schools. Before there was silence about what is the Shoah, what is the Holocaust, who is responsible, how we can prevent this to happen. And now we are educating our children from the primary school. What's the tragedy of Shoah, why it happens, and how we can behave to prevent it, and how our religion is part of the whole religions of the world. And finally, I was amazed just this week. I saw that the Minister of Education inaugurates the first courses of Jewish language to Hebrew language to the children in the primary school. So you can see it's not only in Morocco there is Jewish schools, Jewish courts and justice, but now we are teaching the Jewish Hebrew language to our very young children, 7 years, 6 years. This is, I think, the seeds for having better Middle East, better North Africa, with peace, with culture of accepting the other, and also cooperating for a better future.
All right. Now, Ambassador Ross, from your storied diplomatic career, you're deeply familiar with the Arab world. Do you think that anti-Semitism, which has existed for centuries, is an intractable problem in the region, or is it something that can be mitigated through developments such as the Abraham Accords?
Well, first I would say, obviously, anti-Semitism doesn't just exist in the Middle East. And it is something that obviously has been always identified, I think, with xenophobia, oftentimes identified with populist leaders. So it's a scourge that needs to be dealt with internationally. But you're right, it has been embedded in the Middle East. And I do think what you were just hearing Ambassador Halali talk about, this represents a very important way of really trying to eradicate all of its vestiges. Education is critical. The fact of educating in Hebrew is, I think, a sign of acknowledgement and respect. I think the Abraham Accords for sure can build on this. I think what we see, and Jason referred to this, what we see the moves made by the Muslim World League, this is very important. The more we see an effort to educate on tolerance, the more we see an emphasis on respecting minority rights, the more you see the notion of pluralism being introduced and made more of a reality within the Middle East, the more you'll be able to see real headway made against anti-Semitism. The fact that it exists internationally, not just in the Middle East, means it's not going to be so simple to eradicate it in one place. It needs to be part of a mission, an international mission, to constantly discredit those who continue to purvey it. But yes, I do think the Abraham Accords represent, because what's built into their premise is this acceptance of the faiths and how the faiths need to live together. So I do think it's an important platform for that.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for your time. It was truly enlightening to hear about these developments, which will likely continue to make headlines for the foreseeable future. Now, these officials are setting the agenda for the worldwide fight against anti-Semitism, and they're largely doing so by focusing on the importance of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism as a key tool. So let's get started. We'd like to welcome Ahmed Shahid, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Katharina van Schnurbein, the European Commission's first ever coordinator on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life, and Ambassador Michaela Kuschler, who serves as Germany's special representative for relations with Jewish organizations, issues relating to anti-Semitism, international Sinti and Roma affairs, and Holocaust remembrance. She's also the current chairwoman of Germany's 2020 rotating presidency of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So first up, Ms. van Schnurbein, you've been tasked with not only combating contemporary anti-Semitism, but also fostering Jewish life across the European Union. How would you assess the state of Jewish life in Europe at the moment?
Indeed, it's been very important for the European Commission to look not only at the negative aspects of the need to roll back anti-Semitism, but also the need to remember the Holocaust, but also to look at fostering Jewish life and thereby acknowledge the diversity of Jewish life across Europe, and also the vibrant Jewish life that we see in different European countries.
It's so important.
We see on the one side that we have this diversity, but on the other side, unfortunately, we also see that anti-Semitic incidents are on the rise. In 2019, 3,000 anti-Semitic incidents have been recorded across Europe, and that is probably only the tip of the iceberg, knowing that the underreporting is very high. And we also have to acknowledge that this high number of hate crime goes against a very tiny percentage of European population. So this is very worrying, and therefore we need a real holistic approach to address this. We have on European level different means. One is legal means, for example, with regards to hate speech. The European legislation acknowledges that speech inciting to hatred and violence is illegal, and therefore what is illegal offline also needs to be illegal online. And we have, together with platforms, found a code of conduct whereby they take down illegal speech when it is flagged to them. That is one aspect. But then also we have put forward legislation, the Digital Services Act, which will request from the platforms more transparency on their data flow and the actions of individuals on the net, in order to ensure that we can address hate speech in a more holistic way.
Now, this is extremely important work. I'd like to turn to Mr. Shahid now. You've also been working closely with CAM for quite some time now after you released the 2019 UN Anti-Semitism report, the first ever of its kind, in which you stress the importance of the IHRA definition. Now, can you share with us the impact of the report and the impact its findings have had in the global fight against anti-Semitism? And in particular, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the accelerating pace of IHRA adoptions worldwide.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this important discussion. In my report about 18 months back, I made a strong call for governments to endorse as a non-binding, working definition from the IHRA as an educational tool for awareness raising and for responding to anti-Semitic incidents and anti-Semitism. And I'm very pleased that, both this recommendation, other recommendations in the report have been taken very well. And the real reason for this to happen is because the Jewish communities received my report very well. I was very pleased with the endorsement the communities by and large gave to the findings in the report. That meant that governments, could use the report as a good UN document that they could count on. So I have seen about a dozen states since the report was published endorse the working definition IHRA. It's a very good starting point to make sure that they have a commitment to address all aspects of anti-Semitism. I was also very pleased with the impact it has had on the UN system. So I had a recommendation for the UN Secretary General to appoint a high-level focal point in his office, and he has done that. I'm very pleased that Mr. Moratinos is serving in that capacity. I also called upon states to appoint national-level coordinators to look at this issue. And again, I've seen a rising number of states do that, and the impact they've had has been quite tremendous. I also called upon the importance of focusing on peer-to-peer learning and exchanges, and I've seen again a number of states do that. So on and on, there's been a lot of, I think, positive things coming out of it. Two other points also bear, I think, importance. One is within the UN system itself, beyond the Secretary General's appointment, there's now more focus on addressing issues of anti-Semitism. That's again a very, very positive start. It's a long way to go, but it's a very good start. I also stressed a lot about the online dimension of anti-Semitism, hate speech. And I'm pleased that now than maybe 2 years ago, there's more action from social media and tech companies to address anti-Semitism. And it's been well received by the communities as well. Right. So overall, I think there's been a very positive impact from the report, largely because the Jewish communities endorsed the report, worked with the report, and people have found this to be a good document that they can also relate to. In terms of why there has been a rise in number of states embracing the definition, I think two things. One, of course, is the concern many have about the widespread dissemination of anti-Semitic hatred and the need to respond to that. We see during the COVID pandemic, again, a tremendous upsurge in anti-Semitic discourse and, of course, hate crimes as well. So there is clearly a need for states to respond. No action is not an option, and therefore more and more states are looking at ways to understand this phenomenon, and therefore they turn to the IHRA working definition. So I think these are among the reasons why there's been uptake in that. Of course, there is some resistance, some quarters to the definition, but that's all, in my view, based on a misconception, a misreading of the definition. Nowhere in the definition does it say that it's a legally binding document. The definition is not phrased as a law. It's a non-binding educational awareness-raising tool to be used as a non-binding working definition, and acts that are mentioned in that can be and usually are anti-Semitic, but not necessarily so. So there are safeguards built into it, and the resistance to the definition comes from ignoring these safeguards built into it. So I think we need to keep on pushing for more states, more actors to endorse this working definition.
All right, thank you so much. Now, I'd like to turn back to Ms. van Snoorby. Now, if we may, let's turn to the EU's comprehensive 2021 strategy on combating anti-Semitism. We've been hearing a lot about this lately, and it's a really important issue. Earlier this year, we saw the release of the IHRA handbook and have heard about plans to complement and support member states' efforts. Can you tell us a bit more about the 2021 strategy and what it will take to confront anti-Semitism in Europe and how you're going to measure the strategy's impact?
Yes, thank you very much. In fact, this is a very important aspect to look at the commitment of the European Commission on the one side and the European institutions, but also of the European Union member states. So we had two declarations in the European Council, one in 2018, where member states agreed to draft and to adopt national strategies against anti-Semitism, and also those who have not done so yet, to adopt the IHRA definition. The IHRA definition has been adopted now by 18 member states already, and out of 27, and we wanted to provide them with a handbook in order to know how to make better use of it, because one thing is adopting the IHRA definition and the other thing is to really ensure that these tools are being used. As was said by Ahmed, it is a non-legally binding tool, so it's an educational tool. It establishes a bias, an anti-Semitic bias, and then it needs to be used by law enforcement agencies to recognize this bias in order then for the law to apply or not to apply, depending on the situation. This is an important aspect, and it can also be very useful in the educational context. For example, when teachers have to recognize anti-Semitic biases among students or in the courtyard in incidents. So that's an important, very concrete aspect where we have helped member states also to be able to use this definition better, and also to make it more widely known in civil society. We have seen football clubs adopting this definition. We see in universities, cities, all different entities, because for us at the European level, it's very clear we can have decisions taken at European level, but unless it really trickles down and it changes the societal approach, nothing will change. So this is very important to see that progress. Now,
absolutely.
In addition to the member states' commitments and our concrete support through a working group where we bring together the member states' representatives and the Jewish communities, we will now adopt the first ever strategy on European level against anti-Semitism, which basically will look at three aspects: really preventing and fighting anti-Semitism, ensuring remembrance of the Holocaust, and ensuring that the lessons learned will be also transmitted to the younger generation, and then the support for Jewish life. And that means we use all the tools that we have, from legal tools to policy tools, but also with regards to funding, different networks and different projects, in order to ensure that from the European level to the local level, we can see a change.
Now, let's turn to Ambassador Michaela Kushler, who will reflect on the past year and the major milestones and achievements of the German IHRA presidency, with a particular focus on an increasingly prevalent form of anti-Semitism, that is, Holocaust denial and distortion.
I would like to express my sincerest thanks to the organizers of this annual summit. The IHRA has welcomed the engagement with the Combat Anti-Semitism movement over this past year and the fruitful discussions that have resulted. It is therefore for me an honor to speak to you today. Our work to advance Holocaust education, remembrance and research, to counter anti-Semitism and anti-Roma racism, to work against Holocaust denial and distortion, all of this is at a critical juncture. Over this past year, we have witnessed important developments in how anti-Semitism manifests itself and in the fight against it. We saw how Holocaust distortion became a common feature at protests against coronavirus measures, how people would compare their experience under lockdown to that of Sophie Scholl or Anne Frank, or pin yellow stars with the word unvaccinated written on them to their shirts. We saw how anti-democratic forces were emboldened, with supporters parading proudly in Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts, shoulder to shoulder with others, claiming that 6 million were not enough. But we've also seen acts of kindness and solidarity in the face of scapegoating, people lending a helping hand to support their neighbors, governments and organizations making sure Holocaust survivors are not forgotten in the pandemic. We've seen remembrance efforts transformed for the digital age, bringing people together from all over the world to commemorate those who suffered in new and innovative ways. We've seen social media companies begin to address Holocaust denial on their platforms. And above all, this past year, we've seen people wake up. We've seen more people becoming more aware of how combating anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion is fundamental to safeguarding our democracies. 2020 taught us many important lessons. But among the most important is that the forces we are working to counter do not stop at national borders. To address anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion, international cooperation is essential. And no one individual or government or organization can do it alone. We must work to build a broad and strong coalition against these forces, The Combat Anti-Semitism movement knows this all too well. And there have been other promising efforts too. The IRA, together with the European Commission, the United Nations and UNESCO, launched a global campaign last month, #ProtectTheFacts, to raise awareness of Holocaust distortion and the dangers it poses. This campaign works hand in hand with the IRA's Global Task Force Against Holocaust Distortion and its recently published recommendations on how to recognize and counter it. Distortion remains one of the most worrying gateways to anti-Semitism. The IRA, together with its growing number of partners, is working hard to make sure this issue receives the attention it deserves. What we do over the next months will have a great impact, not only on the fight against anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion, but on the world that emerges from these challenging times. I am therefore confident that the following Greek presidency of the IRA will build on the achievements of last year. One last word. We are now more connected than ever before and are in a unique position to work against this persistent scourge. 2020 taught us that we can work together no matter where in the world we are. And that should give us cause for cautious optimism in 2021.
Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador. Now, Mr. Shahid, this summit celebrates CAM's second anniversary. What do you wish for CAM for its birthday, and how do you envision future collaboration with the organization?
I think CAM has done immense work in its very short lifespan so far. It's been very impressive. And so I have no doubt that it will keep on, notching up its successes as time goes by. And I hope to be working very closely with CAM. I've done that so far, in the 18 months I've been, operating in this space. And not just in the context of my report, I've been collaborating with the chairman in academic arenas as well. So I look forward to working very closely with CAM. And I've been very impressed by the way that we've reached out to other groups, and especially the bridge building with other communities has been very useful. So this broad-based approach, the inclusive approach, reaching out to also communities, and the grassroots approach, these are really tremendous ways of working. And I look forward to working with CAM very closely in the coming year and the time ahead. Thank you.
Thank you all. Your work is truly impactful, and international cooperation is clearly important in tackling these issues. All right, we now welcome back former Special Envoy Carr, who recently became the newest member of the CAM Advisory Board. Now, to close the summit, we'd love to hear from you, Mr. Carr, a bit more about the incredible work that you did at the State Department over the past 2 years and what you hope to accomplish with CAM in the future.
But please stop. First, we have a small surprise for you, Ilan Carr, in recognition of the invaluable contribution to the fight against anti-Semitism. CAM, in its international coalition, has put together a small video tribute to you as a way to say thank you. So please.
My grandfather, because he was Jewish, was imprisoned in Iraq. And my mother, as a child, as a young girl, fled across the border to Iran, and from Iran emigrated to Israel, while my grandfather was still in prison in Iraq. That's my family's history. To go back to Iraq as a United States military officer and to help liberate this country so broken by tyranny was incredibly powerful. One of the first things I did when I was there is lead Jewish services in the former presidential palace of Saddam Hussein.
Do not hold yourselves to anything less than the very highest standards, because we are changing the Jewish world.
If there is an organized movement to
economically strangle the state of Israel, that is anti-Semitic. And the administration has gone on the record as being opposed unequivocally to the BDS movement. This is going to be an office, as I was charged to do, that deals with the world and with the Jewish condition. But we're going to fight this fight because what is at stake here is the future of our country, nothing less than that. The kind of free, decent, democratic society we want our kids to inherit. Just like the hatred of Zionism in the state of Israel, the hatred of the Jew by blaming the Jew for the coronavirus is simply a classic, age-old manifestation. You can't really confront a threat effectively unless you first define the threat. Well, we have the greatest tool ever to define that threat. It's been adopted by more and more countries. It's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is often called the world's oldest hatred. There's a direct line that runs from the plots of ancient Amalek to medieval blood libels to the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust.
Congratulations, much deserved. You did amazing work on behalf of the United States of America and on behalf of the Jewish community. As a great partner of mine, we fought anti-Semitism everywhere and always. We did so with great vigor, with great energy, and always fearlessly on behalf of what was right.
You have made significant strides, but as our sages tell us in Pirkei Avot, you are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it.
As Special Envoy, you conveyed a crucially important and necessary message that we must unite and act now to combat anti-Semitism.
On behalf of the entire Hadassah community, allow me to extend my deepest gratitude, appreciation, and admiration for your service to our country.
You brought people together that I think were beyond the dreams of many of us, that people committed to human rights would also be committed to the struggle against anti-Semitism.
Ilan, thanks so much for all that you've done. Thanks so much for being a great friend and a grade A Pi brother. You've really changed the world and brought this to light.
You have done an incredible work and definitely you leave a mark. We hope and are almost sure that we will be seeing more of you in years to come.
I would just like to take this opportunity to thank you, Ilan Kar, for all of the sterling work that you have done in combating anti-Semitism around the world.
You've been a mentor to me and to thousands and thousands of API brothers over the years.
We want to thank you, Special Envoy Ilan Kar, for expanding the role of your office.
Amazing job. You brought so much light to a place where there was so much darkness.
You have brought great insight and passion, dedication and inspiration to the position of Special Envoy.
He did an incredible job in combating anti-Semitism, and we so much appreciate all his efforts.
Yours was an uphill battle, a battle that is unfortunately still far from over. However, it is thanks to you that there is greater awareness, many more bridges which are wider and stronger, and better policies throughout the world.
Thank you very much, Ilan, for your work in the campaign against anti-Semitism in various ways.
We want to thank him for his passion and professionalism and the way he's pioneered a leading role for the United States in combating anti-Semitism around the world.
Specifically, I want to thank him for not only fighting anti-Semitism, but also encouraging people worldwide to speak out for Jewish life in appreciation for the special contribution of Jewish life to the society in general.
We want to thank Special Envoy Ilan Kar for his responsiveness, his approachability, his incredible energy.
His work has made Jewish communities safer by illuminating the dark scourge of anti-Semitism, leaving it fewer places to hide.
And so for all of this and for more, we at the Lawfare Project are grateful to you, Ilan, and we thank you for your service.
Mabruk and Mazel Tov on these monumental achievements.
Thank you, Mr. Carr, for giving me the courage to continue the fight against anti-Semitism.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. May you go from strength to strength, my friend.
That was something.
I hope we surprised you, Ilan, and really
You
thank you.
certainly did. How moving. I am just, my goodness, you're going to make me cry. That was so nice. Can't thank you enough.
Is there any last thing that you would like to say?
Well, I just wanted to say what an honor it has been for me to serve these last 2 years as special envoy. And now what an honor it is for me to be, as you said, the newest advisory board member of the Combat Anti-Semitism movement. You know, we heard today from amazing people, and as we heard over the course of the summit, much has been done to fight this scourge, but really much remains to be done. And I really think that, you know, the sky's the limit on the extent to which we can roll back the scourge. And we've got to continue the great work we've done and the great work that our partners around the world, including those represented today on this during this amazing conference. You know, for example, we have to continue ensuring the safety of Jewish communities around the world because safety, personal safety, is the key to quality of life. We've got to continue doing that. We've got to continue focusing the attention of law enforcement leaders across the world on hate crimes prosecutions. The video mentioned IRA. IRA is so important because in order to confront a threat effectively, you've got to define it and understand it. And IRA allows us to do that. And Cam has done such great work in pushing for IRA adoption. We've got to focus on the internet. I'm often asked, why is it that anti-Semitism has been rising precipitously for over a decade now? Well, the internet and social media are powerful vehicles. And the far right and the radical left and militant Islam are all making use of these vehicles to drive this hateful ideology. So we've got to counter online hate while, of course, maintaining our values of freedom of speech. The campuses, we heard about that today as well. We've got to come to the defense of besieged Jewish students and stop the tide of Jew hatred on college campuses. And the launching of philo-Semitism programs are key as well, because you can't just be defensive. You've got to also proactively combat anti-Semitism. All of these things are things we've been working on. We've done a lot, and we must continue to do it. And that's why, if I can just end with this, CAM is so important. Just think of whom we heard from today. I mean, statesmen, diplomats, we heard from lawmakers, faith and civic leaders, activists of all kinds. Think for a minute about the enormous collective power represented just in the last few hours. That's the kind of coordinating strength that CAM brings to this fight. And as a grassroots movement that brings together hundreds of organizations and thousands of members, what CAM represents most of all is unity, a united front to meet this historic evil. And you know what? That's not nothing. Just a few days ago, the Jewish people throughout the world celebrated the holiday that represents the defeat of anti-Semitism. No ordinary Jew hatred was this. The anti-Semitism of Haman in ancient Persia represented genocidal anti-Semitism, a plot to wipe the Jewish people out. And there is an instructive message in that for us today. When Queen Esther was approached and said, "For this reason you have been put here, to save the Jewish people from certain doom," what did she say? What was her response? She said, "I'll do it. I'll risk my life to do it." But first, 3 days of fasting. Tell the community I want everyone together to fast together and mourn together. Sackcloth and ash, and only then will I risk my life to intervene with the emperor. What does that mean? What is fasting? What is mourning together? It is taking collective responsibility for the welfare of a people, for the welfare of our world. And Queen Esther understood that without that unity, there is no hope. But with that unity, when people stand shoulder to shoulder and arm in arm and carry each other's burdens, there is nothing that can't be done. Even the imperial decree that was signed and sealed and delivered, even that could be undone if we only stand together. And that's really what CAM represents and brings to this great fight, and why I'm so proud of the work we've done and the work I know we will continue to do together to rid the world of this ancient evil and build that better, more decent, more just future that our children so deeply deserve. Thank you so much. Thanks for today. Thanks for having me. And thank you for all that you do.
Thank you again, Ilan. And Sasha, now is the time for you to also give us some final remarks before we end today's show.
Thank you, Natasha, and what a program we had today. I would like to thank all the speakers who really invested their time, energy to share their insight and inspire us. I also want to thank the CAM Advisory Board members who are dedicated to bolstering the global impact of our movement. Lastly, I would like to invite all of you to join us on March 16 for the first ever Mayor Summit Against Anti-Semitism. It will mark the launch of a new global initiative for municipal leaders committed to push back against religious prejudice. So please visit our website, combatantisemitism.org, to get more information. So thank you, and we hope to see you again very soon.
All right, what an event this has been, my friends. But now it's time to bring it to a close. We hope that you come away energized and inspired to do what you can to push back against anti-Semitism. And if you stepped away for a moment, videos of all of the speeches and panel discussions will be available online. We want you to be part of our movement. Visit the website, register for programs, participate in campaigns. Let us amplify your voice as we stand united against hate and pursue our vision of a world where Jew hatred has been defeated once and for all. So thank you for being with us today. But before we say goodbye, we're going to be treated to a musical performance by Israeli singer Yair Levi. Levi sang El Narefa Nala, Please God Heal Her, in English, went completely viral. It was actually written for his sick grandmother, but it took on a special meaning during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's brought together communities of all faiths and backgrounds during this difficult time. So, Yair, take it away.
Thank you so much for, it's a great honor for me to be part of this event. And from the process with the song Refana, I learned that music can unite people. And it doesn't matter which culture you are and where you come from. We're all human.
Beautiful.
אז נתחזק ונתרפא. El נתחזק ונתרפא. אז נתחזק ונתרפא, אז נתחזק ונתרפא, אז נתחזק ונתרפא, אז נתחזק ונתרפא. אל נערף הנעלה, אל נערף הנעלה, אל נערף הנעלה, אל נערף הנעלה.